So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jacqueline Philpott and I am the Executive Director of AFCI. And we do wish to welcome you from all over the globe today and appreciate you taking the time to be on this call. So I have one of my colleagues with me, Marge Garlis, who's based in Boston, and we've got our Olsberg team here, Kaylee and Leon. So the following report presentation is an update to the original 2019 collaboration between AFCI and Olsberg SPI, adding in a few more areas of research which the team will go through and discuss with you shortly. So I do want to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to the team at Olsberg for undertaking the significant update to the report and to Netflix for their support too. So without this collaboration, we know it wouldn't be possible to bring this to you today. Before I do hand it over to Kaylee to start the presentation, we just wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping items. So this is being recorded, so it can be made available on our website for you to watch later in the week. And you might want to let colleagues know how it went or update them to head online to see this after the fact. And you're more than welcome to send the link around. You can also ask us questions in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on those, and we'll also open up at the end for questions too. And if you have any other further queries after the call, or if you would like a separate presentation for another group, we'll put our contact details in the chat, and you're more than welcome to either contact AFCI or Olsberg. So let's get this show on the road. Again, thank you everybody for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now, Kaylee.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Just this up. Great. Hi, everyone. We are really looking forward to being here to share some of the key findings from our best practice in screen sector development report. And this will be looking at Latin America and the Caribbean in particular. So Leon and I are going to be running through some of the headline results from this report, as well as some background about the study itself, the methodology, and how we pulled the report together, as well as some wider industry context. And as Jacqueline mentioned, please put any comments in or questions into the chat, and then we can also answer them afterwards, after the presentation. So as Jacqueline mentioned, this is a new report that is an update from a report that we completed in 2019 in association with AFCI. The original version 5 years ago looked at production incentives, workforce capacity, infrastructure, and film friendliness. And in this edition, we fully updated and reviewed those sections, but also added 3 new sections on diversity, equity, and inclusion, sustainability, and partner engagement. And we'll look at all 7 of those areas in this study. And this was a partnership with AFCI, and we also received financial support from Netflix to produce this work. And this document is free for all. It's available in 2 different formats. The first is a full report, which is about 120 pages, that is a very detailed analysis of each of those 7 research areas, including everything from key findings, case studies, key considerations, as well as examples of ineffective practices that may hamper the development of an industry. And that also includes a quite comprehensive bibliography for any additional reading that people may want to do. And then to complement this, we've got a shorter key findings summary report. This is about 60 pages. It focuses specifically on the key findings, as well as 4 or 5 case studies. And it's available in 11 different languages. So that's in Arabic, Bahasa, Indonesian, English, French, Korean, Japanese, Malay, Mandarin, Portuguese, Spanish, and Thai. Both of these reports are available on the AFCI website or the Olsberg SBI website. And there is a QR code and link at the very end of this presentation. So I'm going to pass across to Leon to give some background and industry context.
Yeah, thanks, Kaylee, and hi everyone. It's great to be on this call with you all, and please do reach out with any questions either in the chat or at the end of the session. So to jump in with a bit of the industry context that that this study was being undertaken against, as Kaylee mentions, we first did this study in 2019 when we were seeing a very rapid increase in global production volume. And when we kind of turned to redo this work, obviously the context is very different, which I'll come on to. But just a reflection on that growth that the global sector has seen in recent years. There's two data points on the screen. The one on the left is on feature film production at a global level from the Audiovisual Observatory in Europe. Pretty steady. And then obviously a lot of the growth, as we all know, has come from original scripted series. And you will have seen, I'm sure, the FX networks data on the right showing the sort of rapid and large expansion of US produced original series. Of course, there's a lot of other production, particularly thinking of things like local language originals from some of the streamers as well, and obviously domestically produced broadcaster content and other types of content rising as well. So that's some of the context. Moving on to the next slide, it's everyone will also be very aware of the economic headwinds that the global production sector is now facing, particularly, disruption coming out of the US labor strikes over the last year, and some challenges, particularly around things like production cost inflation, which is putting a lot of investor focus on things like incentives. So we're seeing for sure some short-term disruption. I think what is interesting looking at some of the data is the strength that still exists in this sector globally. And you'll see on the screen some data from Ampere analysis, which looks at the growth in content spend up to 2028. And while markets like North America and Western Europe, the very established markets are either forecast to hold steady or decline, there's a lot of growth to come in earlier stage or emerging markets, particularly Central and South America, and also regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Eastern Europe, and Asia Pacific. So, a lot of consumer growth still to come, and therefore a lot of sort of investment runway for producers linked to that consumer growth. Moving to the next slide, I mentioned that in the current environment, and again, everyone on the call will know this very well indeed, but the sensitivity of the sector to incentives and the ability of incentives to reduce risk and reduce cost for investors mean that they play a very, very key role in how production moves around the world, and therefore, a key role in thinking about developing a screen sector. And we, through our work at SPI, spend a lot of time tracking incentives and in some cases designing and developing incentives. And we keep a close eye on Latin America and the Caribbean. I think it's fair to say that at the national level, development of incentive systems has been moving at a slower rate than some other jurisdictions, although we do, there are some key incentives in the region, including Colombia's, for example, that we'll come back to as a case study in a bit. But definitely, some key markets don't currently have major federal incentives. Thinking of Mexico, for example, and Brazil. And one interesting trend in the region, given some of the challenges at the national level, is a move towards the introduction of more regional or municipal incentives. And if we move to the next slide, we sort of briefly, at a pretty high level, outline some of the regional incentives that we track in Latin America, including the Sao Paulo incentive in Brazil, which is run by the city and state government. There's also one in Rio, Jalisco in Mexico, and a number of examples in Argentina. So, there definitely has been development in the incentives arena in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there are, of course, several additional incentives in the Caribbean region on top of the ones on screen as well. So that's some of the context. We'll move into what we mean by best practice, and I'll hand to Kaylee to pick up on how we define this in the study. Kaylee.
Thanks, Leon. So as I mentioned at the top, we have the 7 research areas that we looked at in the study. These are independent areas, but also quite interrelated and are critical for the development on the sector. And what we found is that to have a really strong and sustainable ecosystem, there needs to be a strong offer across all of these 7 areas, but the exact makeup of how these work together will vary region to region. And it's really critical that all 7 are taken into consideration within that local context, and what needs to be developed within that specific area. And then in addition to looking at what we call best practice, so strong and successful initiatives or strategies or interventions that have helped to develop the sector, there's also ineffective. So these will be things that might hamper the development, restrict growth, or hold back progress in terms of that industry's development. And the report goes into those in quite a bit of detail. And across both, all 7 areas, we look at both formal and informal best practice. So formal interventions and best practice are the larger structural elements like legislation, strategies, and guidelines. And then informal refers to all of those practices that enable those formal interventions to be put into place. So the processes, the permitting, procedures, the initiatives that enable that to work together, to progress. So a combination of formal and informal interventions are necessary. And as a result of a strong combination of the two, you'll have a sector that's highly responsive to the very changing sectoral needs. It'll be relevant to both domestic and international productions in that region. It'll be informed closely by the producer needs throughout the production, and also quite responsive to how those changes maybe change and evolve over time. It'll look at both the national and regional contexts, and then both formal and informal interventions should be regularly reviewed to ensure that they continue to be effective and relevant for the jurisdiction. And then just quickly, across the report, we have these 19 case studies. So we have at least 2 in each of the research areas. And the final list was determined through a combination of research done by the team to find best case examples of interventions that have had really successful impacts since they've been initiated. But we also spoke to a number of producers and other people within the industry to understand from a real world practical point of view where they've seen success and where they've seen really innovative programs introduced. And the report goes into quite a lot of detail about what those interventions are, what the impact is, and what key lessons can be taken away for other jurisdictions that are looking to improve elements of their sector offer. So we'll move into the key findings across these 7 areas, and I'll pass back over to Leon for the first few.
Thanks, Kaylee. And yeah, I think as Kaylee said at the start, this is a very detailed report of over 100 pages, and really we're just pulling out some of the top line findings in each area. So please do take a look at the full study. The first of the 7 obviously is production incentives, and I mentioned how critical these mechanisms are for global production flows and also for domestic productions as well, particularly given some of the challenges around access to market-driven finance for domestic or independent productions. And I think that one of the key findings on the bottom left there is incentive systems should focus across both inward and domestic, because both, development of both areas is is very key to having a sustainable industry. Given how important incentives are for reducing risk for producers and offsetting cost, it's therefore very important that a system reduces uncertainty in the way it's used by producers. And I think we see some of the most successful incentives are ones that are regarded as being very easy to use, very stable by producers, and producers know that going to that jurisdiction is going to result in them being able to access that incentive and being paid to that incentive. And I think, in terms of ineffective practice, an incentive that has some inbuilt uncertainty, maybe around ineligible, if there's a lack of clarity about eligibility of certain types of spend, that then gets in the way of developing a successful sector. And that brings us into process speed. And this has become even more of a key focus for producers in the current environment, where the cost of money, the cost of borrowing is high. And again, this is perhaps more relevant to independent work, but the need to sit and wait for a rebate or the payment of a tax credit for multiple years obviously is very, very costly for producers in the current environment. So a system that pays out on time and doesn't have unnecessary delays is definitely much more preferable to any other slower or less bankable system. Budgets and caps, we're not in a world where every jurisdiction can offer an unlimited amount of incentive investment. Producers understand that, and I think the best practice finding here is that if you are administering an incentive and you're dealing with a limited investment amount, then the best practice is to make sure those limitations are clear to producers and make sure producers understand how application windows work, flag application windows far in advance so producers can get prepared. And also we see in some jurisdictions there has been quite creative use of caps to make sure that a larger spread of productions can access a centralized incentive amount, rather than having a sort of open door policy on a first come, first served basis. Just making sure that there's effective use of any limitations in terms of budget. Then uplifts. This is a trend we've definitely seen more of in the past sort of 5-10 years, and this reflects the fact that governments have a lot more understanding of incentives as a flexible policy tool, and there's been increased use of incentives to offer uplifts, which provide the producer with an additional incentive amount in return for a certain type of investment decision, whether it's taking a part of production out to a region in a jurisdiction that doesn't normally receive production, or perhaps undertaking certain hiring commitments. Again, I think with the other areas of incentive best practice, the existence of uplifts is well understood by producers, but again, clarity and making sure they work for productions. And if you have an uplift for a certain type of region, understanding that if a producer has to bring in a lot of crew to be able to service a production in that region, it's not more expensive than the uplift, in which case the uplift then becomes moot, really. And then finally, effective value. There's sometimes a significant difference between the way an incentive is marketed to producers and the effective value or the net value that those producers will actually receive at the end of their production. And I think best practice here for an incentive is being realistic about what your value to a producer is going to net out at the end of production, and not over promising at the start with a very high incentive rate, because I think that very quickly will be, once a production is budgeted, it will very quickly be understood that, what that size of gulf between sort of marketing and reality is. So I think more realistic effective values is definitely one of the best practice findings. I'm just going to briefly talk about Colombia. I mentioned it's definitely one of the early movers in Latin America in terms of incentive, and we have a case study in the report on Colombia's SINA model, which is definitely a best practice, has some key best practice elements in the way that incentive has been designed and the way it's administered, and some quite interesting points to do with both of those areas. And I again would encourage you to look at the report, which has a lot more detail. But as you'll probably be aware, Colombia first introduced an incentive over a decade ago, which has been changed and developed in various ways. The Colombian government introduced the SINA, a transferable tax credit model, which exists alongside the rebate model that it first introduced over 10 years ago. And that has been very successful as a tax credit model since its introduction. There's some data on screen about the number of productions that have been serviced by the SINA tax credit, and the fact they have invested more than $600 million in the country. So clear expenditure impact. I think in terms of the specifics of the SINA transferable credit model, and by the way, it offers a credit worth 35% of investment in production in Colombia. What's really interesting is the investor can sell the tax credit on the Colombian stock exchange, and that tax credit will be bought by high tax paying individuals or companies to offset their tax liabilities. And that's a very interesting model because it reduces the need for producers to find investors directly. It makes it easier to monetize that credit, compared with a system where a producer will have to find those individuals, personally. So that's a key benefit. Another key benefit of the tax credit and of tax credit models in general is that they don't require an allocated budget. There isn't a need for the government to assign an annual budget, because it's funded from the government perspective through forfeited tax revenue rather than an outlay of budget. And as I say, the ease of the system, the fact it can be traded indirectly on the stock exchange nationally, makes the ease of use and the ease of monetization, a lot better for the producer. So that's incentives, a very key area in best practice, key area in developing and maintaining a screen sector. And I think we talk about screen sector development in the study, but also maintaining, in all of these areas, really maintaining good practice is as important as it is for an established market than it is for a developing market. Moving on to workforce capacity, this has been a key area of pressure for many markets globally, particularly when we were seeing very high production levels. And really the key area here is targeted intervention. There's a lot of strategy and policy being implemented in workforce development for the screen sector globally. And I think the best practice finding in the report is that targeted intervention is absolutely the cornerstone of best practice. And that's about aligning training with industry needs. So finding mechanisms in your jurisdiction to understand where the pain points are, where the lack of competitiveness is in the workforce, and making sure that training provision and training focus is aligning with those needs, so that if you are lagging behind in a certain type of crew or a certain grade, there are mechanisms to very quickly start intervening and getting people trained in those areas. And another key best practice in thinking about that is not just thinking about new entrants. A lot of strategy in this area does focus on new entrants, which is absolutely critical, but there's also an opportunity to look at existing workers in other sectors with existing skills that have been developed and bring them in sideways into the screen sector so they can join and develop at a higher level than just the new entrants. So again, that's aligning training with industry need. Industry need is not always about that early entry level provision. It's often about mid-level or sometimes even higher. In trying to figure out what that gap between what the industry needs and what the training sector is providing, another key best practice finding is around data collection. And that's really how we figure out what the gaps are, what the need is. And often in this sector, data collection when it comes to workforce is a very key challenge. It's not a sector that usually tracks workforce in a very organized way. You know, workers move around, they're itinerant in this sector in many jurisdictions. They may work at different levels on different productions. So there's definitely a challenge in tracking and defining data. And then finally, making sure strategies are cohesive, you know, making sure that key stakeholders are coming together, key trainers, key producers, key infrastructure providers, all have a voice in how workforce strategy is being developed. And a final area before I pass back to Kaylee is infrastructure. And alongside workforce, you know, this has always also been a key pain point for many markets in recent years, you know, the need to develop suitable sound stages or other types of infrastructure to service the needs of the industry. A key point here is about timing, and what we mean by timing is understanding the point at which it's going to be most beneficial to introduce infrastructure. And sometimes policymakers can look at a studio and assume it's going to be a short circuit to developing the sector overall, when in actual fact, a studio, it's important to any studio investment that it's done at the right stage in sectoral development, because an infrastructure needs to be supported by workforce and by a strong incentive. And investing too early is you know, runs the risk that studio might, you know, not be as busy as it would be had there been a stronger workforce. And then thinking about pop-up or converted infrastructure, you know, we see a lot of markets successfully using warehouses and other types of industrial space. And then on the non-financial support, just the role that the public sector or public institutions can play in helping sort of seed the ground for private investment, you know, understanding the value of production infrastructure and providing rapid planning facilities, for example, to enable those projects to progress, or finding land for private investors and helping make it easier for those who are interested in investing in production infrastructure is something that the public sector can do. And then finally, on environmental sustainability, you know, this is a cross-cutting theme throughout the best practice study, but making sure that there are, you know, the sustainability of production is being considered right at the inception of any infrastructure development, whatever it may be. I'll pass to Kaylee for the next couple of areas. Kaylee.
Thanks, Leon. So to start with, for me, I have film friendliness, and by this we mean the sort of wider ecosystem that enables production from start to finish to progress as smoothly and painlessly as possible. And that can be quite a challenging task because there are a number of different vendors and inputs that are required for a production to happen successfully. And so it's really critical for a film office or a film commission or someone in a similar role to play quite a central role connecting between the producer, between local governments, between bodies that are in charge of permitting, other vendors, other partners and stakeholders in the region, to try and find a way through to make this as transparent and clear and painless as possible. And part of that is playing that sort of central role is building consensus, helping to make sure that everyone involved understands the process, the role that they play in film production, because some of these groups may not typically participate in film production, so don't realize the role that they could be playing, and ensuring that that communication is happening and that they understand how the industry works and the processes involved. It's also, in terms of permit processes, trying to make these as straightforward as possible. Some processes, and this also applies for things like immigration and customs and tax, can be quite opaque and difficult processes. So a film commission can play a really important role, either in helping to adjust those processes to remove some of those layers of bureaucracy or complexity, but also in helping producers understand that process in that particular location and the nuances involved. And then, of course, helping with access. So helping producers understand what rules are in place to use certain locations, what processes they need to be considering to shoot at night or to close down roads or to use drone shooting. And that is all really important role that film commissions and local authorities can play. The next area is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. And this was included in 2019 in the report, but it was a subsection within workforce capacity, because there is a enormous and very high connection between DEI and workforce. And they both speak to and with each other. But we also felt that DEI was an important enough area that it needed room to fully research and break down all of these different key areas of best practice. So one of the most important things is that integration into workforce development. So making sure that if there are workforce strategies being considered, if there are workforce programs or initiatives, that DEI is being considered from the start of those processes and not as a final consideration or add-on at the very end. By integrating it from the start, it'll make sure that it's as effective as it can be, and that it will work for all the communities involved. And as with workforce capacity, regular data collection is really valuable here. It can be quite complex. There can be some significant requirements and privacy requirements around data collection of DEI data that need to be respected and adhered to. But where possible, by collecting data, that will help not only to evaluate how effective DEI and workforce policies and interventions have been, but also to make sure that they are continuing to be effective over time. So not only getting certain groups and communities into the industry, but making sure that they're staying within the sector and there isn't a particularly high attrition rate after the first 2 years, for instance. And if there is a high attrition rate, by having that data, you can then look at what needs to be done to help these groups and these communities stay in the industry, what barriers they may be facing that are leading them to leave the sector. And then tied to that and the workforce development is the idea of community engagement. We've done quite a number of DEI and workforce programs at Olsberg SBI. And one of the things that we found is that entry into the screen industry, whether it's a new entrant or, as Leon mentioned, moving sideways from another industry, screen can be quite an opaque sector if you're not aware of those existing pathways in. And so community engagement is really valuable, whether that's working with local community groups, education providers, local governments, other potential avenues that can help to connect with these communities and make sure that they understand what pathways are available, if there are certain funding programs, or also avenues for support and advice and help once within the sector as well. And then another area of best practice is around an effective complaints system. So I mentioned that there's potentially, there could be an attrition rate for certain groups after a few years, making sure that if people are facing particular barriers or aren't feeling comfortable in the sector, that there is an opportunity and an option for them to raise these concerns and raise these challenges, and have those complaints heard and respected and acted upon is really important, not only for making sure that there is change in the sector, but helping to fix some of those issues around people leaving the sector after a handful of years or after any particular barrier that they might be hitting. And then the final area for DEI is around authentic representation. And this is looking at both on-screen representation and off-screen. One of the best ways to open up the screen sector to other diverse communities is by making sure that they feel that their stories are being told, that people like them are in the industry, on screen, working within it, and are an important part of those projects. So making sure that if certain stories are being told, that members of those communities are involved as advisors or in the writer's room, or behind the camera as directors, but also are on screen playing within those stories and playing those characters. And then the last area from me before I pass over to Leon is sustainability. And this was another new area in the 2024 report. This is increasingly important across the globe, not only in the screen sector, but obviously the impact is across industries. And it's still quite early days for sort of habit developed practices in the screen sector, but there's been some enormous amounts of progress across the industry, whether that's to do with the infrastructure or catering or other areas where sustainability has been implemented. One of the most important things that came up in this research is around building sustainability and thinking sustainably. And part of that is making sure that these interventions become habits and become implemented across all types of productions, regardless of the budget level, regardless of the type of project, that they become sort of second nature considerations. And part of that is making sure that sustainability is being considered from the very start of the project, and making sure that people are aware of what options they have, whether that is using certain vendors that offer sustainable practices or sustainable materials, whether that is using different types of lighting or equipment that are more sustainable, understanding things like waste management and how that can have an impact on the sustainability of a production. And as this awareness is developed, those sustainable practices become much more ingrained and become much more a standard part of production. And as with some of the other areas, film commissions or film officers or someone in a similar position can play a really pivotal role here, making sure that everyone is aware of what these options are, but also playing that role connecting productions with sustainable vendors in the area, making vendors aware of opportunities to work with productions or funding or any other incentive that may be available to them to engage in the production industry. And then the final one to talk about is just in terms of incentivizing change. And Leon mentioned in the incentive section that there are increasing uplifts, and some of those uplifts that we are seeing added in the last year or two have been around sustainable practices, using green initiatives on production and receiving an incentive for meeting certain requirements and guidelines. But incentivizing change can also be through other ways of identifying and rewarding good practices, either directly through funding or through other behavior changing initiatives. So the last area I'll pass back across to Leon, and this is on partner engagement.
Thanks, Kaylee. Yeah, and this, as Kaylee says, this is the last, the seventh of the 7 areas, and it's a new addition to the report since 2019, and a really critical one, because obviously, you know, it's fair to say that governments, or many governments, have developed a better understanding of what screen production is over that time, and we think it's the hallmark of a healthy sector if you know, producers and vendor companies and government agencies all sort of work together to push the sector forward. The ability to do that is all about engagement and the provision of evidence, so that stakeholders, partners with key decision-making abilities, understand the value of screen production. So there's a few different areas to highlight here in terms of best practice. I think, you know, it's perhaps an obvious one, but identifying key partners is critical, and I'll come on to this in the next slide, some examples of what we mean by that. But, you know, making sure as an industry that, you know, that the right person, the right ministry or the right department is being targeted, and the evidence that they're interested in is the right type of evidence. You know, if it's a finance ministry and they look across the economy in a certain way using certain metrics, it's very important for the screen sector in that jurisdiction to provide data that enables them to look at different sectors with equivalency. And what has worked very well for the screen sector is a prioritization of that economic data that governments require to make economic decisions. So providing the right type of evidence is important. The right type of evidence also means completely transparent evidence. And I think being very clear and honest and transparent with stakeholders, you know, is the best way of building a relationship and the best way of, you know, advocating for, you know, for the sector. I think the slight challenge that we have as a sector is, you know, while the outputs of what the sector produces are well known by pretty much everyone, and any partner you'd be approaching will, you know, I'm pretty certain have seen film and television in their lives. Often there can be a misunderstanding, or, you know, or in some cases negative assumptions about the sector. You know, there's a lot of noise around the sort of red carpet element of the screen sector, and that can sometimes obscure the fact that this is a sector that drives very, very significant economic impact and very, very significant job creation and very, very significant strategic benefits for a country in things like screen tourism. And I think in thinking about messaging and in thinking about partner engagement, it can be really key to tell that story and find ways of telling a new story about a sector that everybody thinks they know, but perhaps don't fully understand. And I think that's what best practice looks like in this area, you know, being able to advocate clearly and transparently, and also being able to tell the story of a sector that isn't always well understood. And just moving to the final slide before we can answer any questions that you may have. This is a model from the report that just outlines what we mean by those types of engagement, or those types of partners for engagement, and also what typically is involved in each. So in terms of central government, legislators, policymakers, there's often a need to evidence, or in some cases convince. As I say, they might feel erroneously that that screen production is only a cultural activity. And of course, as everybody knows, screen production has very, very strong cultural impacts, but it does also have a lot of other types of impacts. And I think the need to convince is sometimes there. In terms of the public authorities, thinking about entities like immigration authorities or customs or police, there's sometimes a need to advocate for more film friendliness, as we were saying earlier, and that sort of building of consensus among those groups. So again, helping them understand the value of support. And often that can be linked to legislators and central government. If ministers and key government agencies understand the value of screen production, then it's going to be easier to build consensus with public authorities. And then in terms of the private sector, often this is about flagging opportunity and helping drive activation into the sector. And that might be around, convincing banks to cash flow incentives or to, provide funding in some way for domestic productions. It could be about convincing insurance companies to look at the opportunities in the sector. It could be around supply chain companies, alerting them to the fact there could be a business opportunity for them. And then just finally, not to overlook key partners like the general public, trade organizations and unions. And again, this is about helping them understand the benefit that public investment in the sector is delivering for the economy overall in all of the myriad ways that screen production does. So thanks very much for listening. As I say, this is a very, very detailed report. It's freely available on AFCI's website, both in the full version and in a summary report in the 11 languages we mentioned, including in Spanish and Portuguese. And we're keen to support its use, for partners across the world. So do please download it and let us know once you've looked at it in detail if there's anything we can, if you have any questions or anything we can answer. But thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Leon and Kaylee. Thank you so much for sharing the presentation. I've been watching the chat and didn't see any questions coming in, but wanted to see if anyone either would like to add a question now or would like to speak up and have an opportunity to ask a question while we're here together. I figured there was one thing I wanted to ask because it does come up often. So I figured I could jump in and ask this question. In regards to the infrastructure section and timing, thinking about perhaps developing a studio, say there's a region that is seeing that there is some interest in filming. Maybe there might even be a studio that wants to come in and they're looking for some significant stage space. And there's nothing within, say, 50 miles of where the film commission is located. Would that fall under a period where the timing seems appropriate to develop a stage? I'm just curious about maybe a specific thought on how to actually think about when the best timing is to develop a stage. I know it's a common question.
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because you're often involves a quite a significant investment decision, and in making that decision, you'll be looking at every pointer you can find to to see what the future looks like. I think with timing, the point we're trying to make in the study is, you know, the fact that all of these areas should be thought of sort of cohesively, that a studio in itself, you know, the early creation of a studio isn't necessarily, you know, it certainly can lead to industry growth, but it's sometimes seen as, you know, the precursor one, you know, the build it and they will come approach. You know, that if a studio is built, then the industry will naturally grow. But actually the timing of it, you know, you absolutely need the incentive piece as well. And you need that incentive to be functioning well and regarded well by producers. And then you also need the crew piece in place, and you need the crew to be, you know, to be functioning and developing, and then, you know, all of the other things as well, you know, the vendors, the supply chain, you know. And I think for, you know, there within that there are obviously levels as well. You know, there are, you know, you might be able to consider some kind of build or some kind of conversion, you know, at a relatively early stage, if those other elements are starting to develop. You know, we don't all have to be at the Georgia or the UK level for that to make sense. I don't know if that answered your question, Marge, or.
I think so. I think especially focusing on the other elements of best practice, especially the ones that were presented during this presentation, it is very important to make sure that you're able to sustain the life of production before you really think about developing that, or not necessarily answer the call. So if someone's looking for a stage, you have to make sure that perhaps it's the best thing for the community to invest in building a stage. Will it really be future forward and useful for productions further down the line, or is it you don't want to do something for just a one-off opportunity and spend that much money and development time and resources on that? So thank you. Well, I have not seen any questions come in the chat, but of course, we did share Leon and Kaylee's emails, and AFCI is happy if you have further questions or need some additional help in connecting with Olsberg to facilitate that for you. Also, we shared the link for the best practice presentation, but again, if you're looking for that, feel free to reach out to me directly or info@AFCI. It's a easier email to remember. We'd be happy to help direct you to that. We'll be within the next 24 hours working to get this presentation posted onto AFCI's YouTube site. So that's something that you'll be able to share with other industry members and leaders in your community, so that people can have the opportunity to watch and learn from this presentation. So thank you all for attending, and we'll look forward to having future communications with you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.